settle in. Get comfortable. Pull the covers up. Close your eyes and let everything else drift away. You're in the right place. The stadium lights have dimmed. The crowds have gone home. But the stories never stop. And tonight, here is one still being written. Picture a small tin-roofed house on a steep hillside, overlooking an Atlantic port so far from mainland Europe that most of the continent barely remembers it exists. Inside, a boy cries, not from any injury, but because his own team has just lost a game of street football. It is a specific and total inability to accept losing, and it will follow him, unaltered, for the whole of the rest of his life. His father works nights and drinks through most of what remains of the day. There is no money for new boots, no obvious path out, and absolutely nothing about this boy's circumstances to suggest that he will one day become the single most followed human being on the entire planet. This is a story about a boy who decided, somewhere very early in his difficult childhood, that talent alone would never be enough. The gap between himself and true greatness would have to be closed through sheer, relentless, almost frightening force of will. It is a story about a rivalry with one other player that would come to define an entire generation of football. And it is a story about a father who never got to see the best of what his son became. It is also about exactly what a son does with that particular kind of grief when walking away from it was never an option he was willing to consider. Let the evening settle around you. Let your body grow heavy. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do except listen. Here is where it begins. He is born Cristiano Ronaldo dos Santos Aveira in February of 1985 in Funchal, the largest town on the small Portuguese island of Madeira. Madeira is a piece of volcanic rock sitting far out in the Atlantic, considerably closer to the coast of Africa than to mainland Europe. He is the youngest of 4 children. His first name comes from an unlikely source. His father chose it in honor of a Hollywood actor turned American president whose films he particularly admired. It is a small and curious piece of family history, connecting a working-class Madeiran household to the wider currents of 20th century global popular culture in a way nobody in that household could possibly have anticipated at the time. The family lives in genuine poverty, in a small house with a corrugated tin roof, in a neighbourhood where opportunity of any kind is in famously short supply. That includes the kind of opportunity that leads to global sporting stardom. His father works as a kitman for a tiny local football club, tending to the boots and the kit of players considerably less talented than his own son will eventually become. The modest, unglamorous job nonetheless places young Cristiano in near constant proximity to a football pitch from the earliest years of his childhood. His father's own life carries significant earlier hardship. He served as a soldier during Portugal's prolonged and deeply unpopular colonial war in Africa during the 1970s. Several historians studying the wider psychological impact on returning Portuguese soldiers have connected that conflict to elevated rates of alcoholism and other difficulties among many veterans. Those struggles continued after they returned to a country still processing the political and social upheaval of its transition away from decades of colonial rule. Whatever the precise combination of factors underlying his father's struggles, they shadow the whole of Cristiano's childhood. It is a private battle that will, in time, take his life far too soon. His mother works as a cook and a cleaner, holding the family together through the same kind of relentless practical effort that so many mothers in similar circumstances have provided across every story this series has told. Even as a small child, Cristiano displays an unusual intensity around competition that sets him apart from the other boys he plays street football with. Teammates and neighbours consistently describe a boy who would cry, genuinely and without apparent embarrassment, whenever his team lost even the most inconsequential informal match. It is an intensity of feeling about winning and losing that most children his age simply do not carry. Childhood friends have recounted matches played on the steep, uneven streets surrounding his family home, using a ball made from whatever materials happened to be available. Young Cristiano's reaction to defeat could be so intense and genuinely distressed that other children occasionally found it easier to simply let him win than to deal with the emotional aftermath of a loss. This reputation followed him into his earliest organised youth football. Coaches at his first local club noted a small boy whose evident talent was matched by a temperament that occasionally required careful and patient management. For him, every training exercise, however minor, carried the same competitive stakes as an actual match. This almost complete inability to accept defeat gracefully would remain one of the most defining and consistent threads of his career. He was a boy who grew into a man who simply could not tolerate losing at anything, ever, under any circumstances. His formal football education begins at a small local club where his father works. Even at this earliest stage, his talent proves impossible to contain within such a modest setting. He progresses quickly to a larger club on the island. By the time he reaches his early teenage years, scouts from mainland Portugal's biggest clubs have begun making the journey to this remote Atlantic island, specifically to watch him play. At 12 years old, Cristiano is offered a trial with Sporting Clube de Portugal, one of the country's 3 great football institutions based in Lisbon. The opportunity will require him to leave behind everything and everyone he has ever known. The genuine wrench of this move deserves proper acknowledgement, because it establishes a pattern of loneliness and displacement that shapes Cristiano's development as both a player and a person. A 12-year-old boy arrives in an unfamiliar mainland city, speaking with a distinctive island accent that immediately marks him as different. He is separated from his family for the first time and thrown into an intensely competitive academy environment. Every other boy is fighting for exactly the same limited number of professional contracts. By numerous accounts from this period, Cristiano is desperately homesick. He reportedly cries himself to sleep on numerous occasions during his earliest months in Lisbon. During rare telephone calls home, he repeatedly asks his family whether he might simply be allowed to return to Madeira. Coaches at the academy recall a boy who kept largely to himself away from training, carrying a level of visible sadness that concerns several staff members. Some raise the matter directly with the club's youth development management. The mockery he receives from other boys because of his accent only deepens his sense of isolation during these formative teenage years. What Cristiano does with this loneliness, rather than allowing it to defeat him, becomes the first genuine demonstration of the quality that will define his career. Rather than retreating from football, the one constant that had travelled with him from Madeira, he channels his homesickness and displacement directly into training. He spends hours beyond what his coaches require, working obsessively on his technique, his fitness and his physical conditioning. Even fellow academy prospects, themselves highly driven young footballers, find the effort remarkable. Coaches at Sporting's academy consistently describe a player whose natural talent, considerable as it already was matched and arguably exceeded by a ferocity of work ethic that few young players anywhere in world football had demonstrated at such a tender age. This combination of genuine natural gift and an almost obsessive willingness to work propels Cristiano through Sporting's various academy age groups with real speed. He makes his first team debut for the senior Sporting side at only 17 years old, in a Portuguese league match where he immediately demonstrates the explosive, unpredictable dribbling ability that will soon make him one of the most talked about young players in European football. His performance style is built around technical flamboyance, elaborate stepovers, and audacious attempted tricks that occasionally frustrate his teammates and coaches, even as they delight the watching crowds. He is still very much in the process of learning how to convert his considerable natural gifts into consistent, match-winning end product. It is worth pausing to understand what this obsessive training regime actually looked like during his formative Sporting years. It establishes a template of self-improvement that would continue, essentially unbroken, for the rest of his career. Teammates describe a teenager who remained on the training pitch long after every other player had showered and gone home, working specifically on weaker aspects of his game, with a dedication that bordered on the obsessive. He reportedly trained with ankle weights during unofficial extra sessions, believing that shedding the additional resistance during actual matches would leave him feeling faster and lighter than his opponents. It was a piece of self-devised training methodology that speaks to a mind already thinking creatively and analytically about performance optimization, long before sports science became the sophisticated, data-driven discipline it represents in modern professional football. This almost scientific approach to his own physical and technical development would only intensify as his career progressed. Its origins lie clearly in these earliest Sporting years. He is a homesick teenager with seemingly nothing but time and an almost desperate need to prove himself, channeling every spare hour into becoming better. Coaches who worked with him during this period consistently describe the difficulty of ever getting him to stop training. He treated every session, whether officially scheduled or entirely self-imposed, as an opportunity that could not reasonably be wasted. Word of this remarkable young talent, both his obvious natural gift and his increasingly obvious dedication, begins spreading through Portuguese football and gradually beyond it. It is a specific pre-season friendly match in the summer of 2003 that finally brings him to the attention of one of the biggest clubs in the entire world. Manchester United travel to Lisbon to play an exhibition match against Sporting as part of the opening ceremony for the club's newly built stadium. Cristiano, then 18 years old, produces a performance so completely dominant against United's own senior professionals that it becomes, almost overnight, one of the most consequential 90 minutes of football in the entire history of the sport. Alex Ferguson, Manchester United's own legendary manager, had travelled to Lisbon with an entirely different transfer target already in mind, but finds himself so thoroughly mesmerised by the performance of this teenage sporting winger that his own priorities shift within the space of a single match. Ferguson would later describe, in his own extensive memoirs, the specific and immediate sense that he was watching something genuinely rare unfold in front of him. It was a level of natural confidence and technical audacity in a player so young that it demanded serious and immediate attention, regardless of whatever other transfer business the club happened to be pursuing at the time. United's own senior players, several of them full international footballers with considerable individual reputations of their own, are given no answer whatsoever to Cristiano's pace, his close control, and his seemingly endless repertoire of tricks and feints. By full time, several members of United's dressing room, reportedly including senior England internationals, are said to have personally approached Ferguson, urging him to sign the player who had just spent 90 minutes running rings around them. Ferguson, never a manager to ignore this kind of unanimous and spontaneous endorsement from his own senior professionals, moves quickly. Within days, Manchester United complete the signing of the 18-year-old Portuguese winger for a fee that, at the time, represented one of the largest sums English football had ever paid for a teenager. It is worth pausing on the specific and genuinely remarkable nature of this transfer story. A single 90-minute exhibition match produces such an overwhelming and immediate impression that it fundamentally alters one of the biggest clubs in the world's transfer strategy within the space of a single evening. Few transfers in the entire history of football have been decided quite so decisively and quite so immediately by a single individual performance. Cristiano arrives at Manchester United in the summer of 2003, still very much the flamboyant, trick-heavy winger who had so thoroughly embarrassed United's own players in Lisbon. He is a player of undeniable natural gift, whose end product, in terms of goals and genuinely decisive contributions, still lags considerably behind the sheer scale of his technical ability. What follows across the next several years at Manchester United represents one of the most complete and remarkable footballing transformations that the sport has ever witnessed. A talented but still somewhat unrefined teenage winger gradually reshapes himself, through the same relentless, obsessive work ethic that had first carried him out of Madeira, into one of the most complete and clinically effective goal scorers the modern game has ever produced. It is worth pausing, before following him to Manchester, to properly register exactly what this specific journey already represented. A boy from one of the most isolated and economically disadvantaged corners of Western Europe arrives at one of the biggest and most historically decorated football clubs on the entire planet, still only 18 years old. He carries with him both an extraordinary natural gift and a deeply personal need to prove himself, forged through years of childhood poverty, paternal alcoholism, and genuine adolescent loneliness. Nothing about his subsequent global fame, however inevitable it may appear in hindsight, was ever guaranteed by his talent alone. It required, in equal and inseparable measure, the specific and unrelenting force of will that had already defined every single stage of his young life so far. It is worth pausing too to properly acknowledge the wider family context that Cristiano left behind on Madeira. His 3 older siblings, and the specific circumstances of their own adult lives, offer a genuinely useful point of comparison for understanding exactly how remarkable his own particular trajectory actually was. His siblings, raised in the same household and shaped by the same paternal alcoholism and genuine economic hardship, did not follow anything resembling Cristiano's extraordinary path. Instead, they built the kind of ordinary adult lives that the overwhelming majority of children raised in similar circumstances of poverty and family difficulty typically go on to lead. This is not intended as any kind of implicit criticism of his siblings, whose own lives Cristiano has always spoken about with evident warmth and loyalty. Once his career began generating the kind of wealth that poverty had denied the whole family throughout his childhood, he provided them with considerable financial support. It is simply to note that his own specific combination of natural talent, obsessive discipline, and sheer good fortune in being spotted by the right scouts at the right moments represents a genuinely rare alignment of factors. Even growing up in the exact same household, shaped by the exact same childhood hardships, does not reliably produce it. One of his older brothers, in particular, has spoken publicly across various interviews about his own considerably more difficult adult path, including struggles with substance addiction. By Cristiano's own account, he provided considerable and ongoing support in helping his brother address those struggles, funding treatment, and maintaining regular contact throughout the recovery process. This particular family thread, rarely discussed in the more triumphant popular narratives constructed around Cristiano's extraordinary success, adds a further layer of genuine complexity to the wider picture of the family and the specific childhood circumstances that produced him. It is a reminder that even within a single household shaped by identical hardship, individual lives can diverge in ways that defy any simple, tidy explanation. Cristiano's first 2 seasons at Manchester United deliver flashes of the brilliance that had so thoroughly convinced Alex Ferguson in Lisbon, but they also reveal quite clearly exactly how much refinement his overall game still requires. Across this early period, he remains a player whose eye-catching individual skill occasionally comes at the expense of genuine end product, prone to attempting one trick too many, when a simpler and more direct final action would more reliably produce goals. Match reports from these earliest seasons frequently praise his obvious talent while simultaneously questioning his overall end product. Several journalists covering the club during this period wonder openly in print whether his evident love of individual showmanship might ultimately limit how effective a player he could become at the very highest level. Senior teammates, several of them established internationals with considerably more experience of English football's specific physical demands, are reported to have occasionally expressed frustration at a young player, seemingly more interested in personal showmanship than in consistently contributing to the team's collective success. Alex Ferguson himself, however, maintains consistent faith in Cristiano's underlying quality throughout this early period of adjustment. He recognises, with the same shrewd managerial judgment that had first spotted his talent in Lisbon, that the rawness in his end product reflects simply the ordinary teething problems of an extremely young player adjusting to a considerably higher level of competition, rather than any fundamental limitation in his underlying ability. Ferguson works closely with him across these early seasons, gradually encouraging a more disciplined and efficient approach to his final decision-making. Cristiano, true to the same obsessive work ethic that had defined his entire life so far, absorbs and applies that guidance with real and sustained dedication. It is during this same period, in September of 2005, that Cristiano's father dies at only 51 years old. The specific and cumulative toll of years of heavy drinking finally proves fatal. Cristiano, only 20 years old himself, and still only 2 seasons into his Manchester United career, is by his own later account devastated by this loss. It is made all the more painful by the specific and complicated nature of the relationship the two of them had actually shared. Reports from this period suggest that Cristiano briefly considered stepping away from football entirely in the immediate aftermath of the funeral. He eventually decided that returning immediately to training and competitive football represented a more meaningful tribute to his father's memory than any period of extended mourning could offer. Cristiano has spoken, in various interviews given across the following decades, with genuine and considered honesty about never having fully known his own father in the ordinary sense that most children know their parents. He describes a relationship shaped as much by his father's struggles with alcohol as by any conventional closeness between parent and child. This particular loss, and the specific complicated grief that accompanied it, produces one of the most consistent and defining personal choices of Cristiano's entire adult life. From this point onward, he becomes entirely and permanently teetotal, a choice he has directly and repeatedly connected, across numerous interviews, to watching his own father's alcoholism slowly and painfully take his life. He has spoken about this decision with particular clarity in interviews given many years later. He describes a conscious and permanent rejection not simply of alcohol itself, but of the wider pattern of self-neglect and self-destruction that his father's drinking had come to represent within his understanding of what a life could become if allowed to drift without sufficient discipline and self-control. This same commitment extends to his own children. Cristiano has spoken publicly about actively educating them from a young age about the specific dangers of alcohol and the specific toll it had taken on their grandfather, determined that the same pattern should never repeat itself across a further generation of his family. When many people processing this kind of complicated parental loss might understandably struggle to maintain the same level of professional focus and discipline, Cristiano instead channels his grief into an even more intensified version of the relentless self-improvement that had already defined his career. It is as though he is determined to build, through sheer force of disciplined effort, the exact opposite of the self-destruction that claimed his father's life. It is worth pausing to properly register exactly how significant and exactly how permanent this particular response to grief actually proved to be. It establishes the foundational psychological architecture underlying the whole of Cristiano's subsequent career. He does not simply mourn his father and gradually move past the loss in the ordinary way that most people eventually do. Instead, he appears to have transformed that specific grief into a permanent and ongoing source of motivation, a determination to build a life, a body, and a career defined entirely by control and discipline. He also sought to avoid anything resembling the self-destructive patterns that had defined his father's own shorter and more troubled life. This psychological transformation, grief converted directly into a permanent structure of extreme personal discipline, may well represent one of the most significant and most underappreciated factors in understanding how Cristiano Ronaldo became the player and the person that the whole world would eventually come to recognise. Across the following seasons, this intensified discipline translates into genuinely dramatic improvement on the pitch itself. Cristiano's decision-making in the final third sharpens considerably, his shot selection becomes more efficient, and his goal output begins climbing steadily. His numbers, still relatively modest during his earliest United seasons, move toward the kind of totals that mark out the finest forwards in the entire sport. It is a specific and measurable transformation that coaching staff and teammates alike note with genuine and growing excitement, season upon season. Manchester United, building around this rapidly maturing talent, alongside several other gifted players assembled by Ferguson during the same period, begin accumulating major trophies with real consistency. Premier League titles arrive in successive seasons as Cristiano establishes himself as one of the most dangerous and productive attacking players in all of European football. The 2007 to 2008 season represents the specific and complete culmination of this remarkable transformation. Cristiano scores an extraordinary 42 goals across all competitions, a tally considerably beyond what even his most optimistic early Manchester United coaches might reasonably have predicted from the flamboyant but still relatively raw teenager who had arrived from Lisbon 5 years earlier. This goal tally proves especially remarkable because Cristiano plays predominantly from a wide attacking position rather than as a central striker. That positional detail makes his extraordinary goal-scoring output all the more statistically unusual and all the more widely discussed across European football. Manchester United win both the Premier League title and the Champions League that same remarkable season, defeating Chelsea in the Champions League final on penalties after a match in which Cristiano himself scored United's opening goal with a towering header. At the end of that triumphant season, he is awarded the Ballon d'Or, European football's most prestigious individual honour, confirming his arrival among the very finest players anywhere on the planet. It is worth pausing to properly appreciate how remarkable this specific arc actually was. A player who had arrived at Manchester United as a talented but tactically unrefined 18-year-old transformed himself across only 5 seasons and through a level of self-discipline intensified rather than diminished by genuine personal tragedy into the finest individual player in the whole of world football. This transformation did not happen by accident, and it did not happen simply because natural talent was eventually allowed to mature on its own timeline. It happened because a specific, driven young man made a series of deliberate and sustained choices about diet, training, tactical discipline, and his own emotional relationship with grief and loss. Few other footballers, at any level of the professional game, have ever demonstrated quite this same degree of sustained and total commitment. Those choices shaped not only his career, but the person he became. This period also marks the genuine beginning of what would become the defining individual rivalry of an entire generation of football, a young Argentine forward at Barcelona, whose extraordinary talent and remarkable story deserve to be told properly on some future night of this same series. begins emerging as Cristiano's most significant and consistent challenger for the status of finest player in the world. The two men play for different clubs in different countries and possess genuinely different styles of individual brilliance. One is built around explosive physical power and relentless direct running, the other around close control and an almost supernatural low centre of gravity. They would spend the following decade and a half locked in the most intensely scrutinised individual sporting rivalry that football, and arguably any professional sport, has ever produced. In the summer of 2009, Real Madrid completes the signing of Cristiano Ronaldo for a transfer fee that at the time represents the largest sum ever paid for a single footballer anywhere in the world. It is a specific and symbolic confirmation that within only 6 years of leaving Sporting's academy, he had become the single most coveted player on the planet. His unveiling at Real Madrid's own stadium draws a crowd so large that it sets a new attendance record for a player's official presentation. Tens of thousands of supporters gather simply to catch a glimpse of the club's newest and most expensive signing before he has even kicked a competitive ball in a Real Madrid shirt. This is a specific and telling early indication of the scale of global attention that would follow him throughout his time in Spain. The move to Spain's most decorated football institution places him directly and permanently within the same domestic league as his great individual rival, transforming an already significant footballing conversation into a genuinely intense, weekly measured competition. That competition would dominate football discourse for the following 9 seasons. Every week brought a new comparison, a new argument, and a new measure of greatness. Cristiano's time at Real Madrid produces individual numbers so extraordinary that they permanently reshape the historical record books of one of the biggest and most successful football clubs in the world. He becomes Real Madrid's all-time record goalscorer, a genuinely remarkable achievement given the sheer scale and quality of attacking talent that has represented the club across more than a century of its history. His goal-scoring consistency across this Madrid period borders on the statistically absurd. He scores well in excess of 40, and occasionally even 50, goals across all competitions in a season, a level of sustained individual output that very few forwards in the history of the sport have managed to maintain across a single season, let alone across nearly a full decade at the same club. In one particular season, he surpasses 50 competitive goals across all competitions. That milestone places the campaign among the very finest goal-scoring seasons any player has ever produced anywhere in the world, at any club, in any era of the sport's long history. Real Madrid, built around Cristiano's extraordinary individual output, alongside a squad of considerable additional talent, win the Champions League on 4 separate occasions during his time at the club. This includes an unprecedented run of 3 consecutive titles across 3 consecutive seasons, an era of sustained European dominance that stands among the finest sustained club runs in the history of the competition. Cristiano's individual contribution to these triumphs frequently proves decisive. Crucial late goals scored in moments of intense pressure, revealing a temperament seemingly built for exactly this kind of high-stakes situation. He appears to actively seek out, rather than shy away from, the pressure of a match's most decisive instances. He scores in multiple separate Champions League finals across this period, a specific and remarkable consistency of performance on the single biggest annual stage that European club football offers. It further cements his reputation as a player whose individual quality reliably rises to meet the exact moments when it matters most. It is worth pausing, at this specific point in his career, to properly examine the nature of his rivalry with his great individual competitor. This dynamic represents one of the most genuinely fascinating aspects of an entire generation of football. For the better part of a decade, the annual conversation about football's most prestigious individual award becomes essentially a 2-player conversation. The Ballon d'Or passes back and forth between these 2 players with such regularity that other genuinely excellent contemporaries find themselves almost entirely excluded from serious consideration. Cristiano himself has spoken, across various interviews given at different points throughout this rivalry, about the way this competition pushed him toward levels of performance and personal discipline that he might not otherwise have reached. It is a genuine acknowledgement that a rival of comparable ability, rather than simply being an obstacle to individual glory, served as one of the most powerful motivating forces of his entire career. Football supporters across the world find themselves drawn into increasingly passionate and increasingly tribal debates about which of these 2 players truly deserves to be considered the finest footballer of the era. These debates frequently generate more genuine public passion and engagement than the actual matches and trophies being contested. This rivalry, sustained at such an extraordinarily high level for such an extended period, arguably does more to grow football's global commercial and cultural significance during this decade than any single other factor. Two genuinely transcendent talents push one another to ever greater individual heights, while millions of supporters around the world debate, endlessly and passionately, the specific and probably unanswerable question of which one of them is actually better. What made this rivalry so compelling, beyond the sheer scale of both players' individual quality, was the specific and genuine contrast in their respective styles and personalities, where his rival's brilliance often appeared almost effortless, a natural, understated genius requiring seemingly minimal visible exertion. Cristiano's own brilliance was built visibly and unmistakably on relentless physical conditioning and competitive intensity. Every touch and every sprint seemed to demonstrate the sheer scale of effort and dedication underlying his considerable natural gift. Where one player's genius felt almost like a force of nature, the others felt like the specific, deliberate product of a will that had simply refused, for over a decade, to accept anything less than absolute maximum effort in every training session and every match. It is worth returning briefly to the summer of 2006 and to a specific incident that for several years made Cristiano one of the most reviled figures in English football. The full story behind that episode reveals something genuinely instructive about the gap that so often exists between a moment's public perception and its more complicated private reality. At the World Cup in Germany, Portugal faced England in a tense and physical quarter-final. The match was still goalless deep into the second half when Cristiano's Manchester United teammate, the talented young English striker whose own story this series has already told on another night, became involved in a physical confrontation with a Portuguese defender, standing on the defender's groin during a heated off-the-ball tangle. The match itself carried additional tension beyond the ordinary stakes of a World Cup quarter-final. England and Portugal had developed a competitive rivalry across previous tournaments, and the presence of two Manchester United teammates on opposing sides only sharpened the unusual quality of the confrontation that followed. The Argentine referee brandished a red card. Television cameras, sweeping across the ensuing confusion, captured Cristiano appearing to speak to the match official before turning toward Portugal's substitutes bench and delivering a distinct and unmistakable wink. The interpretation that immediately and permanently attached itself to this single gesture within English football culture was one of open and deliberate celebration, a Manchester United player seemingly delighting in his own club teammates' dismissal from a tournament that England had entered with genuine hopes of success. Portugal went on to win the match on penalties, and Cristiano, now firmly established as English football's public enemy, returned to Manchester United that same summer, facing genuine, sustained hostility from a portion of his own club's supporters. Several seriously questioned whether his relationship with his English teammate could possibly survive this very public act of apparent betrayal. The actual reality behind this moment, as both players later confirmed across numerous interviews, proved considerably more mundane and less dramatic than the wider public narrative that formed around it. Wayne Rooney revealed that the two players spoke directly in the stadium tunnel immediately after the match, with no trace of genuine animosity between them. Rooney admitted that he had in fact spent much of the earlier match attempting to get Cristiano booked for simulation, a piece of ordinary competitive gamesmanship between international rivals that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the deep personal betrayal English tabloid media had constructed around the eventual wink. In their very first match together back at Manchester United following the tournament, the two players combined directly for a goal. Rooney scored twice and set up a third for Cristiano in a 5-goal victory that pointedly demonstrated, to anyone still questioning their working relationship, exactly how unaffected their genuine professional partnership remained. Within only months, the two players were combining for goals in a Manchester United shirt once again. Their professional partnership remained entirely unaffected by an incident that had for a period made Cristiano one of the most publicly hated footballers in England. This episode deserves inclusion here because it illustrates something important about the often distorting relationship between football's most famous players and the wider public narrative constructed around their every gesture and action. A single, ambiguous facial expression captured by a television camera during a moment of genuine on-field chaos became within days a fully formed story of betrayal and villainy that bore only the loosest possible connection to the considerably more mundane reality of two professional teammates simply getting on with their working relationship. Cristiano would go on to experience numerous further examples of this same dynamic across the rest of his career, a level of permanent, inescapable public scrutiny in which even the smallest and most ambiguous gesture could be instantly transformed into a major international news story. It is worth situating this incident too within the wider and often frustrating arc of Cristiano's international career during this period. A career that, despite his obvious individual brilliance, remained stubbornly short of the ultimate collective success that would eventually arrive a decade later in France. Portugal, playing as hosts at the 2004 European Championship, reached the final on home soil, only to lose unexpectedly to a considerably less fancied Greek side. It was a genuinely painful disappointment that left the teenage Cristiano in visible tears on the pitch immediately after the final whistle, an early preview of the raw, unguarded emotional intensity around international disappointment that would resolve itself 12 years later in such a strikingly different manner in France. It is worth pausing to properly describe the specific goal celebration that became, across the second half of Cristiano's career, as instantly recognisable a piece of personal iconography as any single trophy or statistic. It captures something genuine about the combination of joy, confidence, and calculated showmanship that has always run alongside his disciplined and serious professional character. It is a reminder that even the most rigorously constructed athletic machine still carries within it a genuine and uncomplicated love for the theatre that professional football, at its very best, is capable of providing. After scoring, Cristiano will frequently perform a specific and globally recognised celebration, leaping into the air, rotating to face the crowd, and landing with his legs spread and his arms outstretched, accompanied by an emphatic shout that has become inseparable from his personal brand. This celebration, performed thousands of times across 2 decades of prolific goal scoring, has been imitated by children on playgrounds and amateur players on Sunday league pitches across virtually every country on earth. It is a piece of physical performance that transcends language entirely, immediately recognisable to football supporters, regardless of the country or language they call home. There is something worth noting in the evolution of this celebration across his career. The gesture began as a relatively spontaneous expression of goal-scoring joy during his earliest Manchester United seasons, then gradually became, as his fame grew to genuinely global proportions, an almost ritualised and carefully choreographed piece of personal brand reinforcement. It was performed with the same practiced precision in a routine domestic league fixture as in the most consequential Champions League final. This evolution, from spontaneous joy to calculated ritual, mirrors in its own small way the wider transformation running throughout Cristiano's career. Natural talent and enthusiasm gradually refined, through deliberate and sustained effort, into something more polished, more consistent, and more instantly recognisable on a global scale. It is worth pausing too to properly register the sheer scale of the statistical records Cristiano's career has produced. Considered together, the cumulative weight of these numbers tells its own remarkable story, independent of any single trophy or memorable moment. He stands as the all-time leading goalscorer in the entire history of men's international football, a record built not from a handful of spectacular tournaments, but from consistent, sustained goalscoring for Portugal across more than 2 decades of international representation. Other genuinely prolific international goalscorers from footballing nations throughout the history of the sport have never come close to seriously challenging it. He holds the record for most goals scored in the Champions League, the most appearances in the competition's history, and numerous additional individual records across the leagues and clubs he represented throughout his career. He has scored more official career goals than any other player in the recorded history of the sport. This cumulative achievement was built not from any single extraordinary season, but from an almost unbroken run of prolific goal scoring sustained, remarkably, across more than 20 consecutive professional seasons. These numbers, impressive when considered individually, become genuinely staggering when considered together as a single body of work. They represent a level of sustained statistical dominance that few, if any, other athletes in any sport have ever managed to produce across such an extended period of their careers. Sports statisticians and football historians, attempting to properly contextualize how remarkable this combination of longevity and productivity actually is, frequently note that Cristiano's career goal-scoring output spread across more than 2 decades rather than concentrated within a single golden peak, represents a genuinely different and arguably more difficult achievement than even the most spectacular individual seasons other great forwards throughout football history have produced. Let us slow down for a moment and sit inside that single night in Paris once more, because it is in the smallest, most specific details of Cristiano's behaviour after leaving the pitch that the full scale of his character becomes easiest to feel. It is the final of the 2016 European Championship, Portugal against France, played in front of the host nation's own passionate home crowd. 25 minutes into the match, Cristiano goes down clutching his knee following a heavy collision. After a lengthy and visibly painful attempt to continue, involving several minutes of treatment and several attempts to run, he is finally and unmistakably unable to carry on. He is helped from the pitch in tears, his participation in the single biggest match of his career ending almost as soon as it had begun. What follows, across the remaining 90 minutes and the additional 30 minutes of extra time that this tense, goalless match eventually requires, becomes one of the most quietly remarkable sequences in the entire history of major international football finals. Rather than disappearing into the dressing room or settling passively onto the substitutes bench, as an injured captain might reasonably be expected to do, Cristiano changes into a full tracksuit and returns to the touchline. He positions himself directly alongside Portugal's coaching staff for the remainder of the match. Television cameras repeatedly find him throughout the following 2 hours, gesturing urgently towards specific teammates and shouting tactical instructions that are frequently audible, even over the noise of a packed French stadium. At various points, he appears to physically embody every emotional swing of a tense, tightly contested final that neither side seems able to break open. There is a particular and genuinely striking image from this extended vigil that has, in the years since, become one of the most frequently reproduced photographs from the entire tournament. Cristiano crouched at the edge of the technical area, his injured leg heavily strapped, screaming instructions toward his players with an intensity that appears, if anything, to exceed what he might have brought to the pitch had he actually been playing himself. This is not the behaviour of a player simply accepting an unfortunate injury and waiting quietly for the match to conclude. It is the behaviour of a man for whom the specific outcome of this single match matters so completely that physical incapacity itself proves no obstacle to his continued, total involvement in the outcome. When a substitute forward finally breaks the deadlock deep into extra time, the images that follow capture, in a single unbroken sequence, everything this entire story has tried to explain about who Cristiano Ronaldo actually is. He sprints from the technical area, still in his full tracksuit, favouring his injured leg only slightly, to embrace his goal-scoring teammate. His joy is so complete and so entirely unguarded that it appears to encompass not simply this single goal, but the whole of his career's accumulated frustration at previous international disappointments, stretching all the way back to that tearful teenage defeat on home soil 12 years earlier. He finishes the match and the tournament as Portugal's captain and its most talismanic figure, having played only 25 minutes of the single most important match of his entire international career. It is a genuinely poignant footnote that no scriptwriter, working purely from imagination, could reasonably have invented. It is worth sitting with this specific image for a moment longer, a man whose entire adult identity had been constructed around relentless individual physical excellence, reduced by injury to the role of a passionate, gesturing spectator at the exact moment his career's greatest remaining ambition finally came within reach. That he found a way to remain so completely and visibly engaged, even when physically unable to contribute in the only manner his whole career had trained him to contribute, speaks to something genuine about the total nature of his competitive character. For him, simply watching from the sidelines, however injured, was never going to be an acceptable substitute for total, active involvement in his team's fate. Despite this extraordinary run of individual and club success, one specific achievement continued to elude Cristiano throughout the whole of his 20s: genuine international glory with the Portuguese national team. It was a gap in his considerable trophy collection that critics frequently cited when arguing against his claim to being considered the finest player of his generation. Portugal, a footballing nation of comparatively modest population and historical success relative to the sport's traditional European powers, had never won a major international tournament. Cristiano's repeated near misses at various World Cups and European Championships across the previous decade had become, for part of the wider football-watching public, a recurring talking point used to diminish the scale of his individual achievement. This particular narrative finally and completely resolves itself at the 2016 European Championship in France, though not in any manner that Cristiano himself or anyone else could possibly have anticipated. Portugal's path to the final proves far from straightforward. The team progresses through the earlier rounds via a series of draws and narrow victories, leaving many observers questioning whether this Portuguese squad, containing genuine individual talent but lacking the collective depth of several other leading nations, truly possesses what is required to go all the way. Portugal reaches the final against the host nation, a formidable French side playing in front of passionate home support. Early in the match, Cristiano suffers a serious knee injury following a heavy collision, and after a valiant, visibly painful attempt to continue playing, he is eventually forced to leave the pitch in tears. His participation in the biggest match of his international career ends after only 25 minutes. What happens next becomes one of the most genuinely moving and most frequently replayed sequences in the entire history of major international football finals. Rather than retreating to the dressing room or accepting a passive role on the substitutes bench, Cristiano spends the remainder of the match, well over 90 additional minutes including extra time, patrolling the touchline in a full tracksuit. He functions as an almost secondary coach alongside Portugal's official manager, shouting instructions, gesturing tactically toward his teammates, and offering visible, passionate encouragement throughout every minute of a tense, goalless contest that eventually stretches deep into extra time. Television cameras repeatedly capture him in visible emotional distress throughout this extended vigil, a player desperate to help his team in the biggest possible moment, reduced to the painful position of a passionate, gesturing spectator rather than an active participant. In the 109th minute of extra time, a substitute forward scores the goal that will ultimately win Portugal their first major international tournament. The images that follow of Cristiano sprinting from the touchline in his tracksuit to celebrate with joy and relief become among the most widely shared and genuinely emotional images in the modern history of the sport. That joy and relief appear to encompass his entire career's worth of accumulated frustration at previous international near misses. He finishes the tournament as Portugal's captain and talismanic leader despite playing only a fraction of the final itself, a genuinely unusual footnote to his trophy collection, a major international triumph secured while watching in a tracksuit rather than playing on the pitch. This particular triumph carries a significance that extends well beyond simply adding another trophy to an already extraordinarily decorated career. For many football observers, it represents the final and complete resolution of the criticism that had shadowed Cristiano's individual reputation for over a decade. It is proof that his individual brilliance could indeed translate into genuine collective, international success, even if the manner of that success, watched from a touchline in visible emotional distress, rather than delivered through his direct individual performance, proved considerably more unusual and poignant than anyone could reasonably have scripted. Portuguese football, a proud footballing nation that had waited generations for this kind of major international validation, experiences scenes of national celebration upon the team's return home that rival anything the country had witnessed in its modern history. Tens of thousands of supporters gather in Lisbon to celebrate a triumph that Cristiano himself, despite playing only a fraction of the final, had done more than any other individual to help deliver across more than a decade of sustained international captaincy and individual excellence. Before following him to Italy, it is worth pausing on the moment that most directly precipitated that move, because it stands in its own right as one of the most purely beautiful individual goals the sport of football has ever produced. In April of 2018, playing for Real Madrid away against Juventus in a Champions League quarter-final, Cristiano meets a cross with his back partly to goal. He launches himself into the air and connects with an overhead bicycle kick, struck with such perfect technique and extraordinary elevation that it appears to defy the ordinary physical limits of a 33-year-old body. The ball flies into the top corner of the net. Juventus's home supporters, having just watched their team's Champions League hopes effectively ended by the goal, rise to their feet in spontaneous, prolonged applause, honouring the sheer technical brilliance of what they have witnessed even as it works directly against their own team's interests. Real Madrid's manager at the time, a former France international whose playing career had itself produced one of the most celebrated individual goals in Champions League final history, describes the goal afterward in terms reserved for the very finest moments the sport has ever produced. Cristiano himself has since named that specific standing ovation from a rival club's supporters as one of the most meaningful moments of his entire career, and has directly credited it with influencing his eventual decision to join Juventus only months later. It is a moment that echoes, in its own way, similar scenes involving other transcendent talents whose stories this same series has told, crowds setting aside their tribal loyalty for a few moments to honour a piece of individual brilliance that transcends the ordinary competitive stakes of the match itself. Cristiano's career continues across the following years, with a longevity that itself represents one of the more remarkable aspects of his entire story. He moves from Real Madrid to Juventus in Italy in 2018, continuing to score at a rate that defies the ordinary expectations of physical decline that most elite footballers experience by their early 30s. He eventually returns to Manchester United for a second spell in 2021, and later moves to Saudi Arabian football with Al Nassr. He continues to compete and score at the very highest level well into his late 30s and beyond, a specific longevity that owes an enormous debt to the relentless, scientifically informed physical discipline that has defined his whole adult life since his father's death. It is worth pausing to properly examine exactly what this specific physical regime involves, because it represents one of the most extreme and thoroughly documented approaches to athletic self-maintenance that professional sport has ever produced. Cristiano reportedly eats approximately 6 small meals throughout each day, rather than the conventional 3 larger meals that most people, athletes included, typically consume. This nutritional approach is designed to maintain stable energy levels and support the muscle recovery required by his demanding training schedule. His dedicated nutritionists and physiotherapists are permanent members of his personal support staff, rather than simply being engaged through his various clubs. They work continuously to refine and adjust his regime according to the specific demands of each match and each training block, providing a level of personalized sports science support that few other athletes have maintained so heavily and consistently. He has spoken publicly about sleeping not in a single continuous overnight block, but across several shorter periods spread throughout each day. This unconventional approach to rest, he has said, helps him recover more completely between intensive training sessions. His use of recovery technology, including regular cryotherapy sessions involving controlled exposure to extremely cold temperatures, reflects a broader and genuinely pioneering approach to incorporating cutting-edge sports science into his personal routine. He often adopts specific recovery and conditioning technologies well before they become standard practice across the wider game. Teammates across every club he has represented consistently describe a training ground presence defined by an almost total absence of the ordinary lapses in application that even the most professional athletes typically permit themselves from time to time. He appears to treat literally every training session, regardless of its competitive stakes, with the same maximum intensity and seriousness. This sustained physical discipline, maintained essentially without interruption across more than 2 full decades of professional football, deserves to be understood as directly and inseparably connected to the psychological transformation that followed his father's death in 2005, where his father's life had been shaped and ultimately ended by a fundamental lack of physical self-control. Cristiano appears to have constructed his entire adult identity around the opposite quality. His physical and behavioural discipline has become one of the most frequently discussed and widely admired aspects of his career, independent of the goals and trophies it has helped him accumulate. There is a further significant dimension of Cristiano's later life worth including here, concerning his relationship with Georgina Rodriguez, his partner since around 2016, and the large family they have built together, including several children. Across various interviews in more recent years, Cristiano has spoken about the way fatherhood has added a further dimension of meaning to his relentless pursuit of excellence. He wants to provide his children with the stable, loving, and materially secure childhood that his own upbringing in Madeira had never been able to offer him. This motivation, building a family life defined by the security and stability his own childhood had lacked, adds a poignant layer to the wider psychological portrait of a man whose adult life appears to have been shaped, consciously and unconsciously, by a determined effort to become everything circumstance had denied him as a child. It is worth pausing to consider how completely Cristiano's personal fame eventually transcended the boundaries of football itself. Across the second half of his career, he became something closer to a genuine global commercial institution than simply an extraordinarily gifted athlete. Across this period, he builds a personal brand around his initials and shirt number, an instantly recognizable commercial identity extending across clothing lines, fragrances, hotels, and gyms bearing his name. Few athletes from any sport, in any era, have achieved this degree of sustained commercial diversification. This commercial empire, built gradually across nearly 2 decades rather than assembled overnight, reflects the same discipline and long-term strategic thinking that have characterized his footballing career. It is a deliberate approach to building lasting commercial value rather than simply cashing in on short-term fame. His presence on social media platforms during this same period reaches a scale that represents a genuinely unprecedented cultural phenomenon. For a sustained period, Cristiano becomes the single most followed individual human being anywhere on the planet across major social platforms, placing him ahead of musicians, actors, and political leaders in sheer measurable global attention. Although this achievement seems distant from the football that first brought him to public attention, it represents its own remarkable accomplishment. It demonstrates how completely his personal story, the poverty, the discipline, the goals, and the relentless competitive intensity, has resonated with audiences far beyond those who follow football as their primary sporting interest. In the winter of 2022, following a difficult and increasingly public falling out with Manchester United during his second spell at the club, Cristiano makes the decision to join Al Nassr, a club playing in the Saudi Arabian domestic league. The contract is so financially extraordinary that it briefly makes him, by a considerable margin, the highest paid footballer anywhere in the world. His arrival in Saudi Arabia generates scenes of genuine public excitement rarely seen in the country's domestic football history. Tens of thousands of supporters gather at the airport, and at his official unveiling, immediately confirming the commercial and cultural impact that a player of his global stature could produce within a football market still establishing itself on the wider international stage. This move, arriving relatively late in his extraordinary career, forms part of a wider story about Saudi Arabia's deliberate and heavily funded strategy of investing in professional football. The country uses the considerable financial resources of its sovereign wealth fund to attract globally recognized footballing stars and rapidly elevate the domestic Saudi League's international profile and credibility. Cristiano's specific role within this wider strategy proves considerably more significant than that of a simple, well-paid final career chapter. His arrival at Al Nassr generates immediate and enormous global media attention directed towards Saudi Arabian football, a level of sustained international interest that the league had never previously come close to achieving. His continued high-level performances, scoring goals at a rate that defies ordinary expectations for a player well into his late 30s, lend genuine sporting credibility to a broader project that some critics had dismissed as little more than an expensive retirement exercise for aging European stars. Several other globally recognised players follow Cristiano's lead in joining Saudi Arabian clubs across the following seasons. Football administrators and journalists directly credit this pattern of transfers to the initial credibility and global attention that his arrival established. Whatever the wider and more complicated political context surrounding Saudi Arabia's investment in professional sport, Cristiano's contribution to growing genuine footballing interest and infrastructure within the country represents a further, largely unexpected chapter in an already remarkable career. By this stage, his personal brand and competitive excellence have become powerful enough to meaningfully reshape an entire nation's sporting landscape. It is worth noting too that Cristiano's continued excellence at Al Nassr, well into his late 30s and beyond, adds remarkable weight to the wider story of athletic longevity that runs throughout his career. He continues breaking individual scoring records, representing Portugal at the highest level of international football, and approaching every training session with the relentless intensity first forged after his father's death nearly 2 decades earlier. This is a specific and total refusal to accept that age itself represents any meaningful ceiling on what continued discipline and hard work might still achieve. It is worth pausing, away from the drama of individual matches and transfers, to examine the technical foundations of Cristiano's game. The specific and complete nature of his footballing gift deserves genuine appreciation independent of the sheer volume of goals and trophies it eventually produced. The teenage winger who had arrived at Manchester United relying primarily on close control, dribbling and elaborate individual trickery gradually transformed, across more than a decade of deliberate self-improvement, into a considerably more complete and clinically efficient forward. His heading ability, developed through hours of dedicated additional practice, and through a specific, scientifically informed approach to maximizing his vertical leap, became one of the most feared aspects of his entire game. Cristiano scored a remarkable number of goals with his head, despite standing at a height that, while certainly not short, did not obviously explain the sheer aerial dominance he regularly demonstrated against considerably taller defenders. This particular quality reflects, more than perhaps any other single technical attribute, the specific and total commitment to physical conditioning that defined the whole of his post-sporting career. He treated his vertical leap as a specific, trainable skill, rather than simply an accident of natural physical gifts. His free kick technique, too, deserves particular recognitions, a specific and instantly recognizable technical signature built around a distinctive stationary run-up and a knuckleball striking technique designed to make the ball's flight through the air as unpredictable as possible for opposing goalkeepers. This particular skill, refined across thousands of hours of dedicated practice, produced numerous spectacular goals across his career. Yet the unpredictability that made it so difficult for goalkeepers to save also occasionally made it difficult for Cristiano himself to fully control, a calculated trade-off between accuracy and sheer, unpredictable danger. By his own later accounts, he considered that trade-off entirely worthwhile, given the specific goal-scoring returns it eventually produced. Beyond these specific technical signatures, Cristiano's overall athletic profile across the whole of his career represents a genuinely remarkable case study in deliberate, sustained physical optimization. Sports scientists who have studied his physical conditioning at various points in his career have repeatedly noted body fat percentages and measures of explosive power that would be considered exceptional for a player decades younger than his actual age. These findings offer a direct and measurable testament to the sheer scale of dedicated physical work that has defined the whole of his adult life. Medical staff at various clubs he represented described his physical test results, taken well into his late 30s, as more closely resembling those of a player in his mid-20s. This was a specific and remarkable divergence from the ordinary aging curve that professional sport typically imposes, even on its most disciplined practitioners. Where many elite athletes accept a gradual decline in specific physical attributes as an inevitable consequence of aging, Cristiano's approach appears to have been built around actively resisting that decline through ever more sophisticated training, recovery, and nutritional methodology. He refused to accept that his body's natural limits were quite as fixed as conventional sports science might otherwise predict. It is worth remembering, too, the specific tactical evolution that accompanied this physical transformation. Across the second half of his career, Cristiano gradually moved from a wide, dribbling winger into a more central, penalty box-focused striker. This positional shift maximised his considerable goal-scoring ability, while placing somewhat less demand on the kind of sustained, wide-area sprinting that had defined his earliest professional seasons. This tactical adaptation was made gradually and deliberately across several seasons, rather than being forced upon him suddenly by declining physical ability. It speaks to a football intelligence that matched his physical dedication. He understood, with real clarity, exactly how to continue maximising his individual output even as the demands of elite professional football and the demands of his ageing body gradually shifted around him. It is worth pausing to properly consider the specific and often underappreciated family structure that Cristiano built and maintained across the whole of his adult life, because it offers a genuinely revealing counterpoint to the instability and hardship that had defined his childhood in Madeira. His mother, Dolores, had worked as a cook and a cleaner to help keep her young family fed during the years of genuine poverty that defined Cristiano's earliest childhood. She remained a close and constant presence throughout his adult life, travelling with him across the various countries his career eventually took him to. By his own repeated public acknowledgement, she remained one of the single most important and steadying influences of his entire adult existence. She has spoken, in her occasional interviews, about the specific difficulty of those early years. During her pregnancy with Cristiano, the family's already precarious financial circumstances briefly led her to consider not continuing the pregnancy at all, a sobering detail that adds further weight to the sheer improbability of the extraordinary life that eventually followed. Cristiano has spoken across numerous interviews, with evident warmth, about his mother's sacrifices during his childhood. He specifically credited her with instilling the fundamental values of hard work and family loyalty that would go on to define his adult character. His own children, born across several different relationships and raised together as a single close family unit, receive similarly consistent public acknowledgement, as a central and genuinely stabilizing source of meaning in his adult life. His eldest son, sharing his own name, has himself begun progressing through various youth academy systems, a quietly poignant echo of Cristiano's own childhood journey. Yet this journey is unfolding in circumstances of considerable material comfort and institutional support, standing in genuine contrast to his father's difficult beginnings on a remote Atlantic island. Cristiano has spoken about this generational echo with evident thoughtfulness. He expressed a clear determination that his children experience the security and stability that his own childhood, shaped so significantly by his father's alcoholism, was never able to fully provide him. He has described that determination as one of the single strongest motivating forces behind everything he continues to build, on and off the pitch, even now, so many decades after his own difficult beginnings. Beyond his immediate family, Cristiano has built, across the whole of his adult career, a considerable and consistently documented record of philanthropic activity. He has donated to numerous causes connected to children's healthcare, disaster relief, and charitable organizations across multiple countries. He has personally funded medical treatment for children facing serious illness on numerous documented occasions. In several cases, he chose to keep the details of this support private rather than use it for any obvious public relations benefit. This pattern of quiet, direct charitable engagement stands, as several biographers and journalists have noted, in interesting contrast to the more overtly self-promotional aspects of his carefully constructed public brand. He has also donated significant sums toward disaster relief efforts following natural catastrophes around the world. On several occasions, he personally covered the costs of complex medical procedures for children entirely unconnected to football. These families contacted him directly after hearing, through word of mouth, that he might be willing to help where state healthcare systems had been unable to provide the required treatment. This combination, an extraordinarily public and commercially sophisticated personal brand, existing alongside a considerable record of quiet, less publicized charitable generosity, speaks to a genuinely complicated and multifaceted character. He is capable of the most calculated self-promotion imaginable in service of his commercial interests, while also demonstrating real and sustained generosity toward people facing genuine hardship, often with no obvious commercial or reputational benefit attached to that generosity at all. It is worth holding both of these qualities together, rather than allowing either one to fully define the wider picture, when attempting to properly understand exactly who Cristiano Ronaldo actually is beneath the goals, the records, and the carefully cultivated global brand that the whole world has come to recognize. It is worth returning, before this story reaches its final reflections, to the specific and genuinely significant relationship between Cristiano and Alex Ferguson. It represents one of the most important mentorship relationships in the entire history of the modern game. Both men have described the bond, across numerous interviews given long after Cristiano's departure from Manchester United, in terms considerably warmer and more personal than the ordinary professional relationship between a manager and a player typically produces. Ferguson had taken the considerable gamble of signing an 18-year-old winger based on a single dazzling exhibition performance. Across Cristiano's 6 seasons at the club, he invested heavily in the young player's development. He offered not simply tactical guidance, but a specific and genuinely paternal quality of mentorship. Cristiano, still processing the loss of his own father during these same years, appears to have found that mentorship genuinely significant. Ferguson spoke in his memoirs and subsequent interviews about recognizing in the young Cristiano an almost unprecedented hunger for improvement. He was a player who actively sought out criticism and actively welcomed being pushed harder. That temperament made him, in Ferguson's own words, one of the most rewarding and naturally coachable talents he encountered across his decades-long managerial career, a career that had already included working with numerous other gifted young players across several preceding decades of sustained success. This particular relationship deepened considerably after Cristiano's own father's death in 2005. Ferguson reportedly provided significant personal support during this genuinely difficult period, offering a level of care that extended well beyond the ordinary professional obligations of a football manager toward one of his players. Ferguson reportedly gave Cristiano the specific option of returning home to Madeira for an extended period so he could properly grieve alongside his family. Cristiano ultimately declined, choosing instead to return to training almost immediately, a decision Ferguson himself has since described as genuinely remarkable for a 20-year-old processing such a significant loss. Cristiano has since described Ferguson on numerous occasions in language, suggesting something closer to a genuine father figure than simply a football manager. That is a specific and telling choice of words, given the particular and complicated nature of his relationship with his own biological father. When Cristiano eventually left Manchester United for Real Madrid in 2009, both men confirmed that Ferguson gave his blessing to the move, though with considerable reluctance. He recognised that his own club could no longer realistically compete with Real Madrid's financial resources, while making clear that he considered Cristiano's departure a genuine personal loss, rather than an ordinary transfer business transaction. The two men maintained genuine and consistent contact across the following decades. Cristiano regularly credited Ferguson, in interviews throughout his subsequent career, as one of the single most influential figures in shaping both his football and his personal character, a relationship he described as considerably closer to family than to the ordinary professional connection between a former manager and a former player. When Cristiano returned to Manchester United for a second spell in 2021, several commentators noted the symbolic significance of a player returning in the later stages of his career to the club and the managerial legacy that had first transformed him from a promising but unrefined teenage winger into one of the finest footballers the sport has ever produced. This relationship, sustained with evident warmth across nearly 2 decades and surviving Cristiano's departure to a major rival club, stands as one of the more genuinely touching threads running through his extraordinary career. It is a reminder that even the most relentlessly self-disciplined and self-constructed athletes still benefit enormously from the guidance and belief of an experienced mentor willing to invest in their development during the most formative and uncertain early years of a promising career. It is worth pausing to properly trace the specific and genuinely fluctuating relationship between Cristiano and the wider English footballing public across the whole span of his career. It follows a considerably more complicated arc than the straightforward and ultimately triumphant homecoming that his second Manchester United spell might, at first glance, appear to represent. His earliest years at Manchester United involved gradually winning over initially sceptical teammates and supporters. He was a talented but occasionally frustrating young winger, earning his place through the same relentless work ethic that had first carried him out of Madeira. The 2006 Wink incident, whatever its considerably more mundane private reality, temporarily transformed him into one of the most reviled individual players in English football. It took real and sustained effort, delivered through consistently excellent performances across the following 2 seasons, to properly repair that reputation. By the time of his emotional departure for Real Madrid in 2009, following the club's second consecutive Champions League final appearance, the repair proved complete. Manchester United supporters gave him a standing ovation on his final appearance for the club, tears visibly rolling down his face as the crowd sang his name one final time, a genuine outpouring of affection and gratitude that stood in remarkable contrast to the hostility he had faced only 3 years earlier. His return to Manchester United in 2021, arriving as a 36-year-old, 3-time Champions League winner rather than a promising young talent still building his reputation, generated a similarly enthusiastic initial reception. Supporters and pundits alike framed the move as a fitting and symbolically satisfying homecoming for one of the club's most celebrated former players. This second spell, however, ultimately proved considerably more complicated and less successful than either party had likely anticipated. Manchester United's broader footballing struggles during this period created genuine and increasingly public tension between Cristiano's continued individual excellence and the team's disappointing collective results. That tension eventually boiled over into open and very public conflict. Cristiano gave a wide-ranging television interview in which he expressed considerable frustration with the club's training facilities, its ownership, and its manager, delivering criticism with a directness that generated genuine shock across English football. The interview led directly to the termination of his contract, bringing his second Manchester United spell to an abrupt and considerably less harmonious conclusion than his emotional first departure in 2009. This episode deserves honest inclusion because it complicates any simple, uncritical narrative of Cristiano as a purely admirable figure defined solely by discipline and generosity. His willingness to publicly criticize an institution that had welcomed him back with such genuine warmth speaks to a specific and sometimes prickly relationship with authority and institutional loyalty, one that surfaced at various other points across his career. His considerable self-belief and sense of his own continued value occasionally brought him into direct and very public conflict with clubs, managers and organisations that failed, in his assessment, to properly recognise or accommodate his continued excellence. Whatever the merits of his grievances in this instance, the manner and timing of their public airing left a considerably more complicated final impression of his second Manchester United spell than the warm homecoming originally anticipated, a genuinely messy conclusion to a chapter that had begun with such widespread goodwill on every side. Let us slow down for a moment and sit inside one further evening, this one in the Russian city of Sochi in June of 2018. It captures, in the space of a single match, the same relentless competitive intensity that first defined Cristiano as a small crying boy on the streets of Madeira, now displayed on the largest stage the sport possesses at 33 years old. Portugal opened their World Cup campaign against Spain, a side entering the tournament amid genuine chaos after dismissing its manager only one day before the competition began. Cristiano opened the scoring inside the first 4 minutes, drawing a foul in the penalty area and converting the resulting spot kick with trademark composure. Spain equalised, and Cristiano restored Portugal's lead before half-time, following a goalkeeping error. His second goal arrived with the kind of predatory opportunism that had defined so much of his goal-scoring career. Spain fought back once again, taking a 3-2 lead deep into the second half. They appeared to have weathered Cristiano's individual brilliance sufficiently to secure a hard-fought opening victory. Then, in the 88th minute, Portugal were awarded a free kick from a distance and angle, offering only the narrowest possible margin for a direct shot on goal. Cristiano stepped up, exactly as he had stepped up to take free kicks in matches of every possible size and at every possible level of significance across his career, and curled the ball up and over the defensive wall. The shot dipped with such perfect trajectory and placement that it dropped into the top corner, completely beyond the reach of a goalkeeper who had already guessed the wrong direction. It was his first hat-trick at a World Cup finals, and it made him, at 33 years old, the oldest player in tournament history to score 3 goals in a single match. Television commentary from around the world struggled to find adequate language for what had happened. A single truth emerged. This player, deep into his 30s, remained capable of the same decisive, tournament-defining brilliance that had first announced him as a teenager. The match finished level, 3 goals apiece, and Cristiano left the pitch having single-handedly rescued a result that Portugal's collective performance, on the balance of the match itself, had scarcely deserved. This particular evening in Sochi captures perhaps as completely as any other single match the combination of qualities this whole story has tried to explain. Technical excellence built through decades of deliberate practice, physical conditioning sustained well past the point when most players of his generation had already begun declining, and a total competitive refusal to accept anything less than his maximum possible contribution. Regardless of the scoreline, regardless of his age, and regardless of how many times he had already proven, across more than 15 years of sustained excellence, exactly what he was capable of producing when the moment demanded it most. If you were to gather together every honour of Cristiano Ronaldo's extraordinary career onto a single page, you would find a record that stands among the very finest that the sport of football has ever produced. 5 Ballon d'Or awards, a total matched by only his own great individual rival across the entire history of the honour. Multiple Champions League titles won across 2 different clubs in 2 different countries. Domestic league titles in England, Spain and Italy, a specific and genuinely rare achievement of sustained excellence across 3 of European football's most competitive domestic leagues. Real Madrid's all-time record goalscorer, the all-time leading goalscorer in the entire history of international football, a specific and remarkable record that places him ahead of every single other player, from any nation, across the whole of the sport's recorded history. Multiple European Golden Shoe Awards, recognising the leading goalscorer across every major league in Europe in a given season, won on more occasions than any other player in the history of the honour. A major international tournament victory with Portugal, secured in the most emotionally memorable possible circumstances, watched from a touchline in visible distress rather than delivered through his own direct individual contribution. And, holding all of these individual and collective achievements together, a level of sustained excellence across more than 2 full decades that no other player, at any point in the recorded history of the sport, has ever managed to fully replicate. It is worth considering too exactly what Cristiano's career suggests about the wider and increasingly sophisticated relationship between professional football and the science of human physical performance. He emerged into the sport during an era when sports science, while certainly present, had not yet reached anything resembling the comprehensive, individually tailored sophistication that now characterises elite professional football's approach to player conditioning and player longevity. His own career, spanning this entire transformation, effectively tracks the sport's own gradual and increasingly rigorous embrace of exactly the kind of scientific, disciplined approach to athletic performance that he himself had already begun independently pursuing, through instinct and through sheer personal determination, years before the wider footballing establishment had properly caught up with methods he had, in many cases, already been quietly practicing for years. It is worth pausing to properly consider exactly what makes this specific combination of achievements so genuinely remarkable, beyond the sheer scale of any single individual honour. Cristiano's career has now stretched across more than 2 full decades at the very highest level of professional football, an almost unprecedented longevity that few other players in the sport's entire history have managed to sustain with anything approaching the same level of consistent individual excellence. Where most elite footballers experience a clear and gradual decline in their physical output by their early to mid-30s, Cristiano continued scoring at an extraordinarily high rate well past this point. This was a specific and genuinely remarkable defiance of the ordinary aging curve that professional football typically imposes on even its most gifted practitioners. This particular longevity, more than perhaps any single trophy or any single individual statistic, may well represent the single most instructive and the single most genuinely admirable aspect of his entire career. Direct and tangible proof of exactly what sustained, scientifically informed, and psychologically driven discipline can achieve when applied with total and unwavering consistency across multiple decades, rather than simply a single golden peak. Where several of the other extraordinary talents this same series has explored experienced their own periods of decline through injury, through personal struggle, or through the simple, ordinary erosion of physical gifts over time, Cristiano's own story stands out specifically for the sheer, sustained refusal to accept that any such decline was inevitable. He appeared to treat the ordinary aging process itself as simply one further competitive challenge to be overcome through sufficient discipline and sufficient will. It is worth returning, too, to the specific and defining rivalry that shaped so much of the wider footballing conversation across this entire era, because the eventual and complete resolution of that particular debate deserves genuine consideration. Both Cristiano and his own great individual rival have, across their respective extraordinary careers, produced statistical and honours records so extraordinary that reasonable observers continue to disagree, sometimes passionately, about which of the two ultimately deserves to be considered the finer player. What is beyond serious dispute, however, is the specific and genuinely rare privilege that football supporters across this entire generation were afforded. Watching two players of such completely different styles and such completely different underlying temperaments push one another to consistently greater heights across the better part of 2 decades. It was a rivalry that elevated the entire sport's global commercial and cultural significance in ways that neither player, competing in a footballing landscape without the other, would likely have managed entirely on his own. This same series has already told the story of a joyful Brazilian genius whose own approach to the sport prioritized freedom and personal happiness over sustained maximum achievement, a philosophy standing in genuinely stark contrast to the specific and total discipline that has defined the whole of Cristiano's own career. It has told, too, the story of football's own original global icon, a boy from genuine poverty in the Brazilian countryside who became, through talent alone, the most beloved footballer the world had yet produced, 3 decades before Cristiano's own extraordinary rise from a similarly modest and similarly difficult childhood. And it will, on some future night still ahead of this series, tell the story of Cristiano's own great individual rival, an Argentine boy whose path to greatness, shaped by a childhood growth condition and by a family's own determined sacrifice, followed a genuinely different trajectory to Cristiano's own story of poverty, paternal alcoholism, and relentless self-constructed discipline. There is a particular and genuinely important distinction worth drawing between Cristiano's own story and these other remarkable tales, a distinction that centres on the specific relationship between talent and discipline that each of these different careers ultimately represents. Where several of the other geniuses this series has explored were gifted with a level of natural ability so complete that discipline, while certainly still important, always remained secondary to raw, God-given talent. Cristiano's own story places discipline itself at the very centre of the narrative. He was a player whose natural gifts, considerable as they undoubtedly were, required an almost unprecedented level of deliberate, sustained effort to be fully and completely realised. Football scouts and coaches who assessed Cristiano at various stages of his youth development consistently describe a talented, but not obviously supernatural young player, gifted certainly, but not so overwhelmingly gifted that his eventual rise to becoming one of the 2 or 3 greatest footballers in the entire history of the sport could have been confidently predicted on natural ability alone. This is not to diminish his own natural talent, which was itself considerable enough to be spotted by professional scouts from the moment he was still a small child on a remote Atlantic island, watching football on the same steep hillside streets where his own street football tears had first revealed the specific intensity that would come to define him. It is simply to recognise that his own particular genius manifested less as effortless natural brilliance, and rather more as the specific, deliberate product of a will that simply refused, across more than 2 decades, to accept any ceiling on what continued hard work might still be able to achieve. There is a further comparison worth drawing too, between Cristiano's own story and that of the joyful Brazilian genius whose own approach to the game this same series has already explored, because the 2 players represent, in the clearest possible terms, 2 entirely opposite philosophies for how a supremely talented footballer might choose to live an entire adult life. Where that earlier story celebrated a deliberate choice to prioritise joy and personal freedom over sustained maximum achievement, accepting some measure of decline in exchange for a fuller and more immediately pleasurable life, Cristiano's own story represents the almost complete opposite choice, a deliberate and total subordination of immediate personal pleasure to the specific and unrelenting pursuit of sustained maximum achievement. This pursuit was sustained not for 2 or 3 golden years, but for more than 2 full decades without any meaningful interruption. Neither philosophy is objectively correct, and neither player would likely claim that their own particular choice represents the only valid way to live a remarkable footballing life. But taken together, these 2 contrasting stories offer a genuinely illuminating portrait of the different paths that extraordinary talent can take, depending entirely on the specific values, the specific temperament, and the specific personal history that each individual player brings to the particular gift they happen to have been given. It is worth returning one final time to the specific and complicated relationship between Cristiano and his own father, because it sits at the very centre of everything this story has tried to properly explain about the origins of his extraordinary drive. His father never saw the best of what his son became, dying in 2005 while Cristiano was still a promising young talent at Manchester United, rather than the generational icon he would soon become. There is a genuine and permanent sadness in this specific timing. A man who worked as a humble kitman at a tiny local club, whose own life was cut short by the same alcoholism that had shadowed the whole of his son's childhood, never living to witness the Ballon d'Ors, the Champions League triumphs, or the specific moment of pure joy when Cristiano finally delivered Portugal's first major international trophy from a touchline, in tears, unable to actually play. He never saw his son become a father himself. He never saw the specific and deliberate effort Cristiano poured into building the kind of stable family life that his own childhood, shaped so significantly by his father's struggles, had never been able to fully provide him. Cristiano himself has spoken, with genuine and considered honesty across numerous interviews throughout his adult life, about the specific and permanent nature of this grief. It is a complicated mixture of love for a father he never fully knew, frustration at a relationship permanently compromised by alcoholism, and a determination to build a life defined by the exact opposite of the self-destruction that claimed his father far too soon. In one particularly candid interview, given years after his father's death, Cristiano described attempting to save him during his final illness. He arranged private medical transport in a desperate final effort to prolong his life, only for his father to pass away regardless. Cristiano has described that experience as one of the most painful and formative of his entire adult life, a complete confrontation with the limits of what even his considerable wealth and determination could achieve. Whether this psychological architecture, with grief and complicated love transformed into permanent obsessive discipline, represents a genuinely healthy way of processing such a significant loss, is a question that reasonable people, including presumably Cristiano himself, might answer differently depending on the day they were asked. What is beyond serious dispute is that this response to grief produced one of the most extraordinary and sustained careers that the sport of football has ever witnessed. It is worth pausing to properly consider exactly what Cristiano's international career meant to Portugal as a footballing nation. The scale of what he carried, across more than 2 decades of international representation, deserves fuller appreciation than a simple list of tournament results can convey. It was a burden and a privilege that few other individual athletes, representing any nation in any sport, have ever been asked to carry for quite so long. Portugal, a country of only around 10 million people, has never possessed anything resembling the sheer depth of footballing talent that much larger nations such as Brazil, Germany or England have historically been able to draw upon. And yet Cristiano's sustained individual excellence, combined with a genuinely talented generation of Portuguese players emerging alongside him, transformed Portugal into one of the most consistently competitive international sides in all of European football throughout his international career. Prior to Cristiano's emergence, Portugal's international football history had been defined by considerable individual talent that nonetheless fell short of major tournament success. It was a pattern of genuine promise repeatedly ending in disappointment, a pattern that Cristiano's generation, with him as its unmistakable talisman, finally and definitively broke. He became Portugal's captain relatively early in his international career and retained that role for well over a decade. This sustained position of leadership placed enormous additional expectations upon him beyond his individual performances. It meant marshalling and inspiring an entire national squad across every major tournament Portugal entered during that extended period. Captaining and effectively carrying an entire nation's footballing hopes across more than 15 years of major international tournaments deserves genuine recognition as one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of his career. The pressure was considerably different in character from the pressure of club football, given the heightened emotional stakes that international tournament football carries for smaller footballing nations. Such nations cannot assume that they will simply qualify for, let alone seriously compete in, the game's biggest competitions as a matter of course. Cristiano's response to this pressure, across World Cup after World Cup and European Championship after European Championship, was to consistently deliver individual performances of genuine quality. He did so even when the players surrounding him occasionally fell short of the very highest international standard. Through the sheer accumulated weight of his contribution, he dragged Portugal considerably further in numerous tournaments than the squad's overall talent level might otherwise have reasonably predicted. It is worth noting too that Cristiano's relationship with Portugal's National Football Federation and with various national team coaches was not without occasional friction. Several tactical and personnel disputes surfaced publicly at different points. This was particularly true during the later years of his international career, when questions about his continued central role within an evolving Portuguese squad created tension between his enormous individual stature and the conventional demands of squad management and generational transition. A specific and widely reported incident during the 2022 World Cup generated considerable public discussion. Cristiano was dropped from the starting 11 for a knockout match for the first time in his international career. The incident raised a difficult question. How should a national team manager balance respect for a genuine legend status against the tactical needs of the squad as a whole? Portugal's football culture, so completely shaped by Cristiano's extraordinary 2 decades of service, found that tension genuinely difficult to navigate gracefully. These disputes were genuine, but they never proved significant enough to seriously damage his standing as Portugal's talismanic captain and all-time leading goalscorer. That position he maintained essentially without serious challenge across his entire international career. The complete nature of his commitment to Portugal's national team deserves particular recognition, given the considerably reduced financial incentive that international football typically offers compared with lucrative club contracts. Cristiano continued representing Portugal well past the point when many players of comparable stature might reasonably have chosen to step back from international duty. They might have prioritised rest and continued club career longevity over the additional physical toll imposed by international tournaments. Several football pundits and former players have specifically noted this continued international commitment as one of the more admirable and more easily overlooked aspects of his career. Unlike almost every other dimension of his carefully constructed public brand, this level of national service offered comparatively little additional commercial or reputational benefit, Its reward was mainly the simple, intrinsic satisfaction of continuing to represent his own country at the highest level the sport allows. That he continued, representing Portugal at major tournaments well into his late 30s and beyond, speaks to the same psychological architecture that has defined his entire adult career. It was a complete refusal to accept any limitation, whether imposed by age, fatigue, or simple reasonable expectation, on what continued effort and commitment might still achieve on behalf of the small Atlantic nation that first gave him his name and his earliest sense of footballing possibility. So here, at the end of the night, is where we leave him. Not on a touchline in France, his tracksuit soaked with tears, watching a final he could not play in slowly turn in his own country's favour. Not lifting a 5th Ballon d'Or, or breaking yet another record that the sports historians had assumed permanently unreachable. Not even in the disciplined solitude of a training ground, long after every other player has gone home, still working, still refusing to stop. Let us leave him instead somewhere quieter. A small, tin-roofed house on a steep hillside above an Atlantic port, on an ordinary evening, long before any of what you have just heard had happened. A boy is crying because his street football team has just lost an entirely inconsequential game. It is a complete inability to accept defeat, one that nobody around him yet understands will one day carry him further than any footballer from his small island has ever travelled. He does not know, in this moment, anything about Sporting or Lisbon, or about a Manchester United exhibition match that will change his entire life within 90 minutes. He does not know about a father whose drinking will take his life just as his son's career is beginning to flourish. Nor does he know about the specific, permanent discipline that grief will eventually carve into his adult character. He does not know about a rival in Barcelona, or a night in France when he will finally win everything that had eluded him, from a touchline, in tears, unable to help in the only way he has ever really known. He does not know about a hat-trick in Russia, or a bicycle kick in Turin that will earn him applause from an entire stadium of people who had every reason to want him to fail. He knows only the burning need to win, even at street football, even as a small child, and the private conviction that losing at anything was never something he intended simply to accept. Think about the whole shape of it. A boy from one of the most isolated and economically disadvantaged corners of Western Europe, raised by an alcoholic father and a mother who worked every hour she could find, became, through a level of sustained discipline bordering on the unprecedented, the most followed human being on the entire planet. 5 Ballon d'Ors, the all-time leading goalscorer in the history of international football, Champions League titles won across 2 different countries, a major international trophy delivered from a touchline, in visible distress, unable to actually play, a hat-trick scored at 33 years old against one of the finest defences in the tournament, arriving at precisely the moment his team needed it most, and a physical longevity so complete that he continued competing and scoring at an age when almost every other player of his generation had long since retired. There is a specific and genuinely important lesson embedded in this story, one that distinguishes it from several of the other tales this same series has told. Cristiano Ronaldo's genius was never simply given to him, in the way that some of football's other transcendent talents seem to have received their gifts almost fully formed from childhood. It was built deliberately and relentlessly across more than 2 decades of sustained effort. It was constructed consciously as a kind of permanent monument to everything his father's shorter and more troubled life had failed to achieve. Whether you consider this relationship between grief and discipline inspiring or simply sad, or perhaps both at once, it produced a career that stands, by any reasonable measure, among the very finest that the sport of football has ever witnessed. Football has given us other stories, told across other nights in this same series. Stories of genius undone by tragedy, of hatred slowly transformed into redemption, and of restless searching for a peace that never quite arrives. There have also been stories of joy chosen deliberately over maximum achievement, of remarkable talents nearly lost to history altogether, of an entire team of overlooked individuals defying every calculation together, and of a boy from the Brazilian countryside who became, quite literally, a king. This story offers something different again, a demonstration of exactly what relentless, deliberate, self-constructed discipline can achieve when applied without interruption across more than 2 decades. It is also a reminder that even the most complete and disciplined life imaginable still begins, in the end, as an ordinary child processing an ordinary share of grief and difficulty in whatever way he can find. There is a particular and genuinely useful comparison worth drawing one final time between Cristiano's own story and the specific rival whose career ran alongside his own for the better part of 2 decades. Where that rival's story, still awaiting its own proper telling on some future night of this series, will likely emphasise the specific and almost magical quality of natural, seemingly effortless genius, Cristiano's own story asks us to consider a different, and in some ways more universally applicable question. That question is exactly what an ordinary amount of natural talent, combined with an extraordinary and genuinely unprecedented amount of deliberate effort, might actually be capable of producing. Very few people, anywhere in the world, will ever possess natural gifts comparable to either of these two extraordinary players, but considerably more people possess at least some meaningful capacity for the specific kind of sustained, deliberate discipline that Cristiano's own career so completely embodies. That makes his particular story, in its own way, considerably more instructive and more genuinely applicable to ordinary human ambition than a story built primarily around effortless natural genius could ever hope to be. It is worth considering, too, exactly what this story suggests about the relationship between grief and achievement more broadly. This is a theme that connects Cristiano's own life to countless other stories, in football and far beyond it, of people who transform genuine personal loss into some form of sustained, disciplined accomplishment. There is no suggestion here that grief should be pursued or that loss represents some kind of secret formula for eventual greatness. Such a suggestion would be both cruel and fundamentally untrue to the millions of people who experience comparable losses without any resulting transformation into extraordinary achievement. What Cristiano's story does suggest, more modestly and more honestly, is that it remains genuinely possible for a person to take even the most painful and complicated of losses and build something meaningful and lasting from the specific determination that loss sometimes, though certainly not always, manages to produce. Somewhere tonight, in a gym or a training ground or a hotel room in whatever city his current career happens to have taken him to, a man in his 40s is very possibly still working. He is still refusing to accept that his own body's natural limits are quite as fixed as everyone else assumes they must be. He does not appear, even now, to have any specific intention of simply stopping, or of finally allowing himself the kind of rest that most people would consider entirely reasonable after a career already this extraordinary and complete. There is something worth sitting with in this particular refusal, a genuine and open question about whether a man who built his entire adult identity around never stopping will ever actually find a way to stop. Once his own body, eventually and inevitably, finally forces the issue in a way that sheer force of will has so far always managed to postpone, what then? Perhaps that specific refusal to stop, more than any single trophy or statistic, is the truest and most honest way to understand exactly who he actually is. He is a boy who once cried over a lost game of street football, and who grew into a man who simply decided, somewhere very early on, that stopping was never going to be an option he was prepared to consider. Let that be the picture you carry with you as you drift off tonight. Not the trophies and not the records, but the boy on the hillside, crying over a game that barely mattered, already carrying within him the specific, unstoppable refusal that would carry him further than anyone from his own small island had ever travelled before. Rest now. Let all of this settle. Let your body grow heavy and your mind grow quiet, in a way that this particular man, by his own frequent admission, has rarely allowed himself to fully experience. The stadium lights have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, but the stories never stop, and this one, unlike so many others this series has told, has not finished being written yet. Sleep well, Cristiano. Rest easy, just for tonight, and know that the boy who refused to stop already proved, a very long time ago, exactly what he set out to prove.